Ethics and Therapeutics, Lacan's Misreading of Alice Balint. I gave the title of Ethics and Therapeutics trying to think of a term that would compose with therapeutics, and also thinking of Jacques Lacan. More concretely, of something Lacan had written in variations of the standard treatment, Variantes de la cure type, an article from 1955 gathered in the Écrit, namely that, I quote, and this is my translation, I'll quote it in French as well, that psychoanalysis is not a therapy like others, que la psychanalyse n'est pas un thérapeutique comme les autres, adding later that what may account for that particularity was a rigor, I quote, a rigor in some way ethical, without which all treatment, even if filled with psychoanalytic knowledge, would be nothing but psychotherapy. Une rigueur en quelque sorte éthique, hors de laquelle toute cure, même fourrée des connaissances psychanalytiques, ne saurait être que psychothérapie. This rigor, Lacan continues, would require a theoretical formalization that should not be confused with a practical formalism, meaning by the latter, what is or not to be done, I assume, in a psychoanalytic session. I think it should be made clear that both what Lacan calls theoretical formalization and practical formalism refer here to the better or worse, one better, the other worse, ways of thinking about questions of technique, the technique of psychoanalysis. That is, to give Lacan's minimalist definition, what psychoanalysts do. That is the technique of psychoanalysis. We might forget this from time to time, among other reasons, because of the trajectory the work of Lacan has had in the academic world. But I believe that, like Kant's, Lacan's theoretical formalizations are in the service of practice, understood doubly as clinical praxis and practical reason. Lacan's point being that in psychoanalysis, these domains cannot be separated from questions of ethics, beginning with what is the end of analysis. And end is here taken in the double meaning as the kingdom of ends. The article I mentioned furthermore was conceived during Lacan's seminar on Freud's technical writings given at the Sainte Anne Hospital to a small group of analysts in 1953 and 1954. Yet what is it more concretely that analysts do? In psychoanalytic sessions where an analysand is present, they generally speak, interpret, or remain silent, abstain from interpretation. I am not a practicing analyst, nor a historian of science, so I cannot speak much of what they do within the institutions they found or to which they belong, which seems to be full of passion and intrigue. What they also do, however, and perhaps mostly, is read. Not only does an analyst read the unconscious of a patient during a session, but also as a theoretician, he or she reads other texts, other analysts, and engages in theoretical formalizations. This might sound like a superficial point, but it is important to emphasize given Lacan's own reference to a rigor which could be in some way ethical. The word cure in the title of the article the word cure in the title of the article I cited earlier was translated in English as treatment. But let us retain the term cure from the Latin curare, to take care, prendre soin. This term is familiar to us. Psychoanalysis is a technique of care. As Julia Kristeva so aptly put it, a post-romantic, I quote, a post-romantic and first amongst modern thinkers, Freud takes it upon himself to make a cure out of love, unquote. We could say that what constitutes the technical framework of analysis, the relationship between the analyst and the analysand, is the artificial production of love. Transference love, which not for being artificially produced is less authentic, love and the transference love the analysand feels for the analyst are one and the same, depends simply on a structural position of the analyst vis-à-vis the analysand. For example, the position of someone with a presumed knowledge or of someone to whom one tells the truth. For example, John Forster talks about Sandor Ferenczi and that he fell in love with everyone to whom he told the truth. And if one of the most important, and is one of the most important tools of psychoanalysis. A notion of transference prevalent in many camps of technique is that this love relationship established between analyst and analysand in some way repeats earlier love relationships, such as that between the analysand and a parent, a mother or a father. So now I'm coming to what is more properly my topic. So in a key moment of this seminar on Freud's technical writings, which is seminar 1, Lacan engages in a drastic criticism of the concept of primary love, on which the Hungarian psychoanalyst Michael Balint, I don't know how to pronounce it in Hungarian, Michael or Michel Balint based his understanding of analytic transference. I call it a key moment because I think that it is this criticism that allows Lacan to begin to formalize his position with respect to object-relation psychoanalysis, developed on the other side of the channel. A theoretical formalization that I believe will be condensed in the phrase, there is no object relation, and then become, there is no sexual relation. This works better in English than in French, but this trajectory does not matter enormously. What matters is that this critique is based on an equally drastic misreading of an important argument about relations in an article by Alice Balint, who had been Michael Balint's wife, which Lacan repeatedly refers to and which is called Love for the Mother and Mother Love. Thus not about any relation, but at least until now, paradigmatic relation of care for the prematurely born human, or for the prematurely born human or non-inhuman being that we are, the mother and child relation. As I will try to show, this misreading does not lack a certain rigor, in the sense that what I will propose as a better reading, the reading that Lacan systematically erases, nevertheless gives the direction of his conclusions, and later of, I think, his model of perversion, in a sense, which Gerard referred to. Yet I believe that it is also a matter of rigor to restore this article the attention that it deserves. Alice Balint, and here I will mispronounce, I'm sure, her name, her second last name, Tsekeli Kovacs, was a Hungarian psychoanalyst, anthropologist, and mathematician. She was born in Budapest in 1898 of the psychoanalyst Vilma Kovacs, so her mother was a psychoanalyst as well, herself an analysand of Sandor Ferenczi. As a young student of 19, Alice lent Totem and Taboo to a classmate, friend, and later husband, Michael Balint, thus interesting this student of medicine and mathematics in the new science of psychoanalysis. Fleeing the counter-revolution that followed the fall of the Bela Kun regime in Hungary, the couple moved to Berlin in 1921, where they both began analysis with Hans Sachs on the same day. Some few years later, the Balints returned to Budapest and finished their training with Ferenczi. After the Austrian Anschluss, both Jewish, even though Michael had changed his name from Bergman to Balint, Alice, Michael and their son John moved to Manchester with the help of Ernest Jones and established, not without difficulty, their psychoanalytic practice there. In August of the same year, 1939, Alice died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. The article Love for the Mother and Mother Love was the last one she published before her death. Michael Balint decided to include it in a collection of his articles from 1952 called Primary Love and Psychoanalytic Technique because, in the words of his preface, Their intellectual, and I quote, development was so intertwined that this book would be incomplete in the true sense of the word without her contribution. Without doubting the veracity of this collaboration, let us note that the language of complementarity, mutuality, and reciprocity were only chance determined, and this is what Michael Balint said, that only chance determined who of the two would publish a particular idea. This language that Lacan will take so seriously and dislike so much is Michael Balint's, not Alice's. And it's interesting that in the reading, Lacan is perpetually confusing, in a sense, what is her argument and what is her husband's. And in the article in the Écrit, which is very much a condensation of this seminar, the reference to her name completely disappears, and in the footnote it's just M. Balint. So that idea of mutuality or reciprocity is very much the model by which he reads her work, as not distinguishing it from her husband's. In this article that appeared in Hungarian, parts of which appeared in Hungarian in 1933, and its final version, and whose final version was published in German in 1939, Alice Balint describes a type of love encountered primordially in the mother-child relationship and involving a severe overlooking of reality, in which the interests of the love object are not recognized. In other words, it is an egotistic love. She calls it naive egotism that Alice Balint will describe as innocent when speaking about the baby's love for the mother, since the boundaries between self and other are not yet determined at this stage. The baby takes what it needs from the mother, as if, she says ironically, she had no interest of her own. From a cursory look at the scarce literature in this article, it is only Nancy Chodorov who picks up on this irony. Others, including Lacan, taking the supposed absence of interest literally. Thus, at no point it is a question in Balint's article, unlike in some of her husband's work, of a complete coincidence or reciprocity of interests between mother and child. Rather, it's the opposite, in a sense. Balint does talk of a period very short in the baby's life when it is absolutely dependent on the mother's body, in which providing care gives the mother instinctual satisfaction. She calls it instinctual satisfaction. But the problem that underlies her argument is precisely the fact that this time ends prematurely for the child. So it ends for the mother earlier than, always earlier than the child is prepared to accept. In other words, what her article is about is the asymmetry of these interests. For Lacan, this article becomes paradigmatic of a total error. This error would consist in positing the mother-child relation as an archetypical relationship, which will then be reproduced in the analytic room, and more problematically, the error lies in conceiving it as a completely closed dual relationship on the level of mutual satisfaction or complementarity of needs, thus not on the level of desire between mother and child. He calls it a relation imaginaire supposée harmonique en saturant les désirs naturels. He also sees in this article the idea that this relationship is completely based on some kind of animal instinctual level of mutual satisfaction. One of Lacan's problems with this construction is that he sees no way out of it. Thus, he cannot see how the child might grow out of this type of relationship into what the Balints, in this case, both call genital love, a form of mature love where the interests of the other are recognized and where a certain frustration is tolerated. So this primary love, more generally in the work of Michael and Alice, is also equated with pregenital love or with a moment of polymorphous perversion, which then might or should, in a mature relationship, evolve into genital love, which would entail a recognition of the other's interests, in a sense. And in this, Lacan sees some kind of Hungarian Puritanism, I suppose because there is some kind of teleology in that genitality. But in fact, Alice doesn't talk about genital love in this teleological way, only in the way of that you need to exit that type of love in order to recognize the other's interests. Michael Balin does, in his writings, have an account of how, so to recapitulate, Lacan doesn't see how you might get from this the relationship that he sees as completely reciprocal, etc., into, and that doesn't recognize the other, into one where you might recognize the other, see the other as somebody with independent interests. But in fact, Balint, in his other writings, has an account of how pregenital love might be transformed into genital love through what he calls the technique of conquest and negotiation, through the use, that would be more the natural version, or the version outside of the psychoanalytic room, and through the analytic situation, in order to allow the analysand to regress into this primordial attachment, this time within a more reliable framework, in order to be able to exit it. We could say that his therapeutic work is entirely about this transition, in a sense. How do you go from pregenital to genital love? I'm not going to engage very much with his, with Michael Balin's theory, because I don't know all of his work, but whatever the emphasis of Michael Balin's theory, the difficulty that Lacan is pointing to is a real one, namely, how do you go from one type of relationship to another, yet not one that might be wooed away, as he will later realize theoretically. For what Lacan proposes as a solution to this impasse, so the impasse of how do you go from one to the other, is to retroactively assume intersubjectivity as having been there from the beginning. So he says we must assume that the primordial relationship is primordially intersubjective. And he will later, in seminar 8, not retract this position, but criticize the idea of intersubjectivity. In fact, this gesture simply repeats both of the Balins, whose hypothesis of an archaic object relation is there precisely to challenge or replace the hypothesis of a primary narcissism, a conception that for Alice Balint, I quote, did not do justice to the fact that this kind of love was always firmly directed towards an object. However, Balint insists in keeping both terms. Alice Balint insists in keeping both terms, both narcissism and object relation, side by side. In the same way that she insists to keep the term primary archaic object relation instead of dual unity, as she had been suggested upon readings of her paper. So she says in an appendix that there has been a discussion, and most people were suggesting that she substitutes the term dual unity, and then she's very adamant in saying that she will not take that term unless they understand something else by dual unity. And so there is more of an irony in that her argument has been completely transformed into meaning this dual unity out of which you cannot exit. So her insistence in maintaining the object relation and the narcissistic model side by side is what allows for a sort of transitional reality, avant la lettre, or before Winnicott's paper on transitional phenomena. Lacan insists in reframing the question in terms of the gaze, proposing Sartre's description of the intersubjective dimension of perversion, not only seeing, so the intersubjective dimension of perversion being not only seen and being seen, but knowing that one is being seen. When the problem Alice Balint is pointing towards was that of not being seen by the child, which is then reproduced in the analytic situation as not being seen by the patient. In fact, she talks about certain analysis in which the patient, she had been away for several months for an illness, which might have been the illness that will later lead to her death. And she describes a situation in which the patients are angry at her for not being there for them, but they're not angry in the way of considering her her interest or in considering her as a person, but more in the way of in the same way that babies are angry when their mothers are not available immediately, not recognizing their interests, but more because they're not there for them at the moment. But there is not a moralistic attitude that she's taking to this egoism of the patients, but she's trying to explain it in a sense through and affirming, still affirming that it is a matter of egoistic love and not just egoism. Yet the egoistic love that she's describing entails this characteristic blindness concerning the person of the analyst. This suggests a model of perversion that is exactly inverse of to the Lacanian one, in which surplus is an excess of seeing. It is not a being seeing seen, but a knowing of oneself as not seen, as anything but an object of satisfaction. So Lacan uses this idea of primary love as a model that does not take on account the symbolic dimension, but is enclosed, fermé, in an imaginary model of mutuality, reciprocity, and complementary. So he will reject this model on this basis. Now, and what I want to do in a sense is to recuperate the idea of primary love. Let us now return to the article itself in order to see what this reading, Lacan's reading, is not seeing, namely the structure, the disjunctive structure of Alice Balint's argument. This structure entails a fundamental asymmetry, as I said earlier, precisely between the love of the child for the mother and the love of the mother for the child. An asymmetry that Balint shows in its most violent extremes. The starting point of the argument being that these are two irreconcilable subject positions. They are irreconcilable precisely because in love the other, or in this type of love at least, the other is an object. So they cannot both be subjects at the same time. That's why the entire article is structured through this asymmetry. The disjunction of point of view is then redoubled by a disjunction which we could describe as that between the point of view of civilization and the point of view of another of civilization that will be represented by criminals and native mothers. So mothers who kill their children, basically. So the paper is structured in three parts. Part one is from the point of view of our civilization in some way, if we want to call it, and the other is giving these examples. And in the second part, it's from the point of view of the mother. So from the point of view of the child, as we have seen, what we have is a naive egoism based on the rejection of the interests of the other, involving a loss of reality. The ideal mother, says Balint, has no interest of her own. There is a fantasy for the fantasy construction for the child. This love is equivalent to a demand of, I quote, absolute unselfishness from the part of the mother, or what is equivalent in fantasy as a murderousness towards the mother. One of the interpretations that are given to one of the cases, there is the meaning, in a sense, that is discovered in the symptom. We discovered in it the deep conviction that it belongs to the duties of a loving mother to let herself be killed for the well-being of her child, should occasion demanding it arise. However, this demand manifests itself in clinical cases as a reverse structure, namely daughters that have to be slaves of their mothers, insofar as the demand for absolute unselfishness is transformed as a debt that needs to be paid with absolute submissiveness. We see here, of course, the paradigmatic structure of perversion. It's interesting in a sense to relate it to our earlier discussion of the debt. So from that model, it would be seeing both sides of the sacrificial act of the mother transformed into a debt that is impossible to pay, and that therefore becomes a kind of perverse master and slave relationship. On the other side, on the side of the mother love, what before was a fantasy of murderousness becomes, or takes a place of reality. So this is how section 2 begins. Turning now to mother love, I will again start with an example. A young mother told me her opinion of a lecture on criminal psychology, which she had heard on a previous day. The lecturer spoke about the case of a woman who was unhappily married and in her despair murdered her 2 daughters and then tried to commit suicide. Through a series of associations, we come to the example after this. Through a series of associations, we come to the examples given by Alice Balint, who was also an anthropologist, of Central Australian mothers who in cases of extreme deprivation would, and I quote, bring about an abortion with their fingers and eat the fetus. And an Inuit mother who also ate her child in a period of famine, and the perception is that she ate the child because she thought, or in the construction, it is a part of herself, and that's also how she saw how the community saw the punishment for her, because she had eaten a part of herself, in a sense. So it was this, that was the punishment was structured on that. Balint adds that Roheim, from whom she gets his account, does not mention, I quote, any feelings of guilt or remorse in these mothers, since the children appear to these women to be their own property or part of themselves. So we have the absolutely chiasmatic structure of the point of view of the child and the point of view of the mother. So having dismissed the mother-child relationship as a primordial one, Lacan will turn in his seminar to Hegel's dialectic of master and slave, which he received via Kojève. So he rejects that and says that's not the primordial relationship. The primordial relation is this other one. However, it is interesting to keep these paradigms side by side, because what is at stake in the mother-child relationship for Alice Balint is precisely the struggle for recognition, a recognition from the adult child of the mother as having interests of her own, and a recognition from the side of the mother towards the adult child as not being her property any longer. I quote Alice Balint. So there are the two sides both times. The problem is not only that children do not recognize, grow, or when they grow, they still demand from their mothers absolute unselfishness. This when the model, in a sense, breaks down, because these structures persevere in adulthood. And from the mother's side, this is what she says: for the mother, the child is never grown up, for when grown up, he is no longer her child. Is not this yet another proof of the remoteness of maternal love from reality, such as the child's love is remote because he never imagines his mother as being within, with divergent, that is to say, self-interests, right? So they're both constructions that are removed from reality, but that involve this non-recognition of the other as somebody with their own interests, with self-interest, which cannot come naturally but has to emerge. So this adult relationship, in a sense, a mature relation, or this mutual recognition, cannot come naturally, but has to emerge from a primordial relation of non-recognition, which is in some way inevitable, since it is determined by the fact that the child is absolutely dependent on the mother, which is the same problem that I was saying Lacan had seen. How do we go from one to the other? But that's precisely the problem, in a sense. Mm-hmm. In other words, there is the inverse model of the dialectic. We begin not, and now I'm referring to Hegel's, but also through Kojève, and not, I'm not going to be able to comment too much on the Hegelian dialectic, but we could discuss that. But we begin not with an equality that through a struggle for survival becomes unequal, becomes an asymmetry of master and slave, but with an inequality which is not yet properly intersubjective either. I think in Hegel's case is also the case. So we begin not with equality that through this struggle becomes unequal, but with inequality which needs to arrive ideally to an equality, right? So the opposite. This happens not because of a renunciation of death, but because the mother, in this case, the mother is occupying that position, agrees on an imaginary level to be killed for the sake of the child or of the slave. So we would have an inverse model of the dialectic. And I wrote this before the comment of Francesco, so he would correct me on that. But I think Lacan's idea of the dialectic is that there is a renunciation of death, in a sense. Now, why do we put the mother in the position of the master? And here is where we turn to the paradigmatic relation from the point of view of the mother love in Alice Balint's paper, which is the institution of abortion. And here I will quote Alice Balint. It's a longer quote. The institution of abortion is a paramount factor in the relation between mother and child. Women all over the world know of artificial abortion, so that it is women who have the final say about the existence or non-existence of a child. She opens a parenthesis. This fact is undoubtedly one of the reasons why the mother appears sometimes so weird and gruesome to the child, whose life depends in the truest sense of the word on whether it pleases her or not. Close parenthesis. The undeniable fact of psychogenic sterility points to another fact, namely that the child who is born is always the child who was wanted by the mother. Moralizing condemnation or penal prosecution of artificial abortion are probably only defensive measures against the dangerous absolute power of the woman. It is another defensive measure that the right over the child's life, which originally was maternal, was transferred to the paterfamilias. It argues for the originality of the maternal right, that it is an informal and private affair of the woman. The paternal right, however, is a social institution. Unquote. So the technique of abortion for Alice Balint, which is an artifact, not a natural fact, and is assumed by her to be a universal possession of women, is what founds for Balint maternal right as the mother's original power over the life and death of the infant, a fact that, not for being original, ceases to be weird and gruesome. Patriarchy is here described as a defense mechanism against this, I quote, dangerous absolute power of the woman to decide over life and death in the position of master. This is where Balint, if she had encountered the work of Lacan, would probably locate the dimension of the real, perhaps. In her model, the mother rules. So in her model, one of the criticisms, perhaps I should say, of Lacan to this construction is that it lacks the symbolic dimension, and that is why he's going to use this relationship as the one that allows him to introduce the third term, or the symbolic. What I'm saying is that the symbolic is, we could retroactively see it in this article in many places. One of the places is that Alice Balint says that this relationship to the mother that is problematic for all the reasons that I enumerated is happening at the same time as the child recognizes the father as having interests of his own. So it's not that the father is absent, it's just that in relationship to the child, the father is from the beginning a subject, in a sense. So the symbolic is there from the beginning, but it doesn't solve the problem. And then she adds this other dimension that is, in a sense, the repressed of culture, or we could say the repressed of patriarchy, but in her article also works as a repressed of culture in general, which is this maternal right. So in her model, the mother rules in the real, the father in the symbolic, and the child in the imaginary. Because for the child, all that there is absolute rule, in a sense in which he or she are there for his needs to be satisfied, etc. But it is, and she emphasizes this idea, it is completely in the imaginary, and it also exists in the counterposition for the mother, this fantasy of the child ruling absolutely. So that the imaginary relationship to the mother, not under the sway of reality, is completely coexisting with the symbolic relationship to the father, where this recognition does take place. And now I want to, okay, so just to recapitulate, the two positions are the point of view of the child, which is also the one that coincides with the civilized view, that from which the mother is seen as lacking any interest of her own. This fantasy is sustained on the condition of a loss of reality. From the point of view of the mother, illustrated by uncivilized behavior, the first is a reversal of the situation where the child is seen as property of the mother, completely objectified, sacrificable, etc. Again, no identity of interests or mutuality is assumed at any point. Eating the fetus in case of famine does not mean that the interests of the child are perceived to be identical with those of the mother, obviously. So, having seen this fundamental asymmetry, I want to return to the question of ethics and therapeutics, because I think it is important. I mean, all the things that I was saying about the maternal right is not to say that she was trying to say that is what civilization is repressing, and that is something that we should strive for, or anything like that, or that recognition would even solve any of these problems. And I think what I'm trying to say is that she's showing this overt side, the other side of this imaginary construction of the sacrificial mother, in order to show that there is something to this repression, in a sense. And this is how I was trying to solve the disjunction. So in thinking of ethics and therapeutics, it would be relevant to perform an anamnesis of the psychoanalytic concept of primary love, or archaic love, as a concept that maintains both primary narcissism and object relation, but also that maintains this asymmetry that I said. So we have love for the mother and mother love, but we also have this term that we might say is produces some kind of metastability between both, which is primary love. as developed by Alice Balint, as a metastability between the polarities exemplified by the disjunction of love for the mother and mother love. Yet by showing that artificial abortion as a technique that constitutes the repressed pole of the idealized technique of maternal care as absolute unselfishness, Balint is also posing life as primordially resulting from a decision of love. And I think that's actually the key point. So she's bringing out this modernness, all these terrible examples, which Lacan even calls heroic in some way, to bring this repressed side of the idea of maternal care. But in order to say that civilization, and taking in a sense unproblematically this division that she makes between the civilized world and the uncivilized examples, civilization is marked primordially by a maternal decision of life. Every child born, says Balint, is a child wanted by the mother. So the technique is prior to civilization, and the technique is one that, in a sense, is rejected. And I was thinking with what, Bernard, what you were saying in the beginning, it is what she calls the technique of artificial abortion is that primordial weapon for her, in a sense, that is most of the times not used. So life is also based on this not using of that technique. So every child born is a child wanted by the mother. And that is already a solution, in a sense, to these polarities that I showed. Because one thing is to say this murderousness exists on the level of fantasy and can, in a sense, be worked through in the therapeutic situation, and another is saying, from the other point of view, the things that are not happening in our civilization, right? So this murderousness is not happening at the level of reality. What we have is children that are wished by the mothers. And that in some way, she's not saying that, she's saying that as an absolute rule. It's a formalization. She's not describing a situation. If one would probably try to see it empirically, you would probably get into a lot of problems. But she's seeing this as a formalization, as a possibility of a formalization. The fundamental asymmetry of the mother-child relationship also means, with respect, for example, to Winnicott, that every mother of an adult who survived childhood is a good mother, right? And it doesn't have to be a mother, obviously. It could be somebody else or something else that would take that position. But in a sense, it is saying everybody that survived childhood has to have been wished, or his or her life has to have been wished. And there we are completely at the level of desire and not of need, as this problematic non-reciprocity shows, right? So posing love as primary implies, in the work of Balint, and here I refer to both, that hate is a secondary formation. And actually, Alice Balint is a little bit more nuanced in this idea. Michael Balint basically says that all hate is a secondary formation, that what the analytic practice, analytic experience shows is that there is no congenital evil. So it's a theological position, in a sense, to what is primordial. There is no congenital evil. We can explain through the analytic situation every evil as coming from suffering, etc., and it can be worked through. That is Michael Balint's position. Alice's position is true hate is pure aggressiveness. Pseudo-hate is originally always a demand for unselfishness from the mother. So hopefully we see how the positions, in a sense, have reversed. I'm not trying to say that this ideal formation or this ideality, which is this assumed unselfishness, is something bad. In a sense, she's trying to show that that it is a necessary ideality in some way. And that it might even explain what she calls pseudo-hate. It is explained because at the bottom of that hate there's always a demand for unselfishness, which is also what Lacan would say a demand for love. This might be a theological move, yet it is one where the therapeutic situation, constructed as an artificial or technical reproduction of that matrix, and here I'm thinking of the analytic session, but we could extend this idea of an artificial or technical reproduction of love as transference to educational situations or to other institutions of culture, can also become ethical. So this is where I see the ethical and the therapeutic, in a sense, merging, which is also very similar to what you were saying this morning about changing what is primordial, in a sense. If you have peace as primordial with respect to war, in a sense, this is the same thing in terms of love and hate. And this construction does in fact not lack the rigor that Lacan was speaking about of a theoretical formalization. Civilization depends, this is how I see the article, in a sense, the summary of this article would be just that civilization depends for its reproduction on the fact that the most vulnerable beings depend for the most crucial period in every life cycle on the absolutely powerful. This is a parasitic and most of the time non-reciprocal relationship, and nevertheless it works, and the only explanation that and the framework for it working, according to Alice Balint, is the notion of primary love. Thank you.